Alright, so gonna make a video, um, and hopefully this helps to whatever the circumstances is. Okay, so I got my laptop here, my notes, and gonna talk about our first few things before I get to anything else. I don't know if I've put this on video yet before, but Frankie, he proposed to his wife at Wendy's. Believe it or not, he was very young, or at the time I was with him. It was just me, Frankie, and Robert Palomo, which was when he came. This is 22 years ago, and Frankie, we were eating at Wendy's, I want to say, and I think we were eating at Wendy's at that time, and we just stopped by to get something to eat. Could have been somewhere else, I don't remember, but I want to say it was at Wendy's over by Old Denton and the George Bush, I think it is, near the dollar movies we used to go all the time. And I remember Robert Palomo being, sort of like being in La La Wonderland when he was hearing the conversation, when he was telling Robert Palomo that he got down on one knee and proposed to her at Wendy's. Because you got to understand, I don't know if very many people get, I don't know what stories people think of, Romeo and Juliet and these fancy weddings that exist, but in the reality of life, that sort of romance or whatever it is, it doesn't really exist very often. I mean, you hear about these stories of like Mariah Carey, and they have, or whatever, Janie Jameson, porn stars, all these, whatever it is, they have these unbelievable perfect weddings at the biggest royal chapels and whatnot. And even then, most ranchers don't last. But I do remember that Frankie said that he had got down on one knee and proposed to his wife, and at the time I didn't know his wife was a transgender, but I thought she was a real female. I don't know why. I just didn't really question it. He got down to his partner, or his whatever. So, given the idea that Robert, okay, because this is the complete opposite of what Palomo would have expected, or I mean, maybe not expected, but completely opposite to what he's used to, because Robert Palomo does royal weddings, okay, out in New York, and he's done royal weddings for real life princesses in different countries, like in Saudi Arabia and all these other countries, where he's done just the highest lavish weddings you can ever imagine. So hearing that his own sibling that is at a Wendy's, you biggie sized it, you get French fries, you get the Baconator, you sit down at a fast food restaurant because you sort of connected with this person, and you didn't necessarily thought of all the stuff in the future, as opposed to so many people always want this ta-da, right? But I remember thinking of that, and I was like, wow, and because I was watching Robert, and he was just kind of like, oh wow, and he was kind of like, so you proposed to your wife over at Wendy's? Wow, that's really romantic. That's really, because because Robert's used to that whole diamond covered floors, limousines for everyone, jet airplanes, red roses, all over the ground, just everything decked out to the highest level of kings type of weddings, with the artistic value of like Picasso and Leonardo da Vinci and whatnot. So I've never been to any of them, but you can look up at his website. But I've never said that before, and I remember thinking of that. I was like, I do remember Frankie saying he proposed to his wife when he had a Wendy's. The redheaded girl, it was at Wendy's. So anyway, there was also another subject that I wanted to talk about. This one's completely different. Uh, this is about Mrs. Hughes. Mrs. Hughes she's no longer alive. I mean, there's no way she could be alive. By the time that I was 15, 16 years old, um, she was already like 60, 62 years old. I mean, she was like going to retire within a few more years. I don't know if that was going to be her last year or not. But Miss Hughes was my 8th grade teacher that I had, which I always looked forward toward that class, usually because it was my language arts class, and I had a girl next to me, Crystal Fuentes, who from DeWitt Perry, who I used to talk to, and she was kind of like, I was always trying to hook her up with a friend of mine, Jeremy King, because he really liked her a lot. And so I was always trying to like do whatever I could to like upgrade him, to hook him up with her. And he was the blonde hair, blue eyed, blonde hair, goofy looking guy that probably couldn't get a girlfriend. And I was like the total opposite of him. And so, since so many of the kids knew who I was, and I was sort of this popular kid, I was always trying to hook him up all the time. So I, like, oh man, he's, yada yada. So I'd say anything, but we used to talk about all kinds of shit. But anyway, Drew Hill was next to me, and he was I think he was in a drug class with me once. But Miss Hughes' class is I think that's the class where I had to bring in the sheet of paper that you have to get an approval to be able to talk to the guy who was coming from Auschwitz, and not from Auschwitz, from Dachau. And I think I want to say I was right about that. I did read up that guy, and he went to a couple of different ones, but I want to say he was on his way marching to Dachau, but I don't know what the last camp is. I want to say I think I did get that right. I want to say I think I did. They got that right. But you can look that up, and I don't know what I'm reading anyway. So this is about the Holocaust Museum I plan to go. I still have yet to go see the 3D hologram. I'll probably do that sometime soon. But I went to the museum. I actually been to that museum before. I just never went to the 3D hologram stuff. So anyway, I wanted to watch this, talk about this. She was the teacher we brought this forum into, and I had a really good relationship with her. She favored me. I remember talking to her, and she favored me. And this is one of the things that when I look back at now, I can 100% see the conflict. And even I knew that there was intense conflict even when I was in elementary school because of the gays and transgenders versus straight women. And it was nasty. One of the best people of all the teachers that I can think of right now that I have that's probably a good chance they're probably still alive. Hopefully you would have talked to them long ago. Best person you would be able to talk to is Mrs. Weiss. Mrs. Weiss was my 6th grade teacher who was a substitute at first, who replaced Miss Rosen. And she was the teacher that, I'm telling you, it was a fucking full-blown homosexual transgender war against her. And they had to write like petitions because all the gays and transgenders all ganged up and went after her. In fact, it was so bad that all the teachers were transgenders and gays, and they would all unite with one another, and there was constant fucking wars. And it was really fucking bad because the principal and the assistant principal were also lesbians. And it got so bad that they would allow them to do whatever the fuck they wanted. I mean, they were running a free game. They couldn't believe that what the fuck was going on. And I remember Miss Weiss stressing out really fucking bad. And I want to say her husband was, because Miss Weiss was a really tiny, short lady. She was like 4'11". She was like really, really tiny. And I remember her looking at me because the teachers, there was very specific things that I remember that I had to do with the relation of Frankie, the rape that happened to Frankie, and Michael Jackson. And the other one was, is Hector gay or not? Because the teachers will run their sort of game on you to see if you're part of their team or not. And if you do, then you're recruited. If you're not, and then that's how it works. So there was something fishy about this, but I knew how to stay sort of elusive at this time. And I remember Miss Weiss, picking up on it, like, this guy, this one really likes women. This one's not gay. And, you could tell with some, and I remember that, and it was really wild. It was really wild to see some of this shit, because she had a lot of problems with these homosexuals, that they were just, it was full transgender, and the transgenders were fucking teachers, and I'm telling you, they grouped up in fucking teams and were fucking crazy. Like, they ran the show, they say who got fired, they say who fucking got the raise, they always felt comfortable, feel sorry for their disability is transgender disability, feel sorry for them again, they're doing for the pride of movement. It was very nasty, and I remember just picking up on a lot of this shit. It was really fucking bad. I remember I don't know if her husband was straight or not. I don't, there's a lot of women don't do that these days, because, especially even then, because they know who's in charge, who runs the whole show. But I'm going to say her husband worked in law enforcement. I think he worked in law enforcement and he was a really tiny, short fucking guy, and he was like, and I remember he had to show up a couple of times, because he had to sort of, and he didn't show up in his police uniform. He showed up like in his regular clothes, like her husband, and he sort of have a stance, because the transgenders were so vile and teaming up and controlling the situation, just to keep the straight women in their fucking box, to keep them closed in. And I remember that very well. And I haven't forgot about this. I've been wanting to talk to Miss Hughes. So Miss Weiss, I don't know if she's still alive. She would be the best person to tell you. It was really bad. I remember being very observant of this time. So when I get to middle school, when I turned 7th grade, I saw Miss Hughes in 7th grade. She was a 7th grade teacher, and that was it. I turned to 8th grade, and I'm in Miss Hughes' class, reading, right? I didn't have her for any classes for 7th grade. But when I was in Miss Hughes' class, I remember her being sort of depressed, and she warded off to stay, like, she would, stand by her door and be like, who she looked like to me? She always looked like a fine, like, very fine, put together, polite, sort of domestic, like the lady that you would see at Grandy's that used to feed you biscuits. Like, back in the day when I was a little kid, they used to hire old ladies that were like 85 years old, and you had to be old. You had to be at least 80 years old and a full set of white hair and look like a grandma to get this position. And there were the ladies that worked near this sort of makeshift old school 1940s to 1940s, like more like a 1920s cooking stove oven that was was just there for display, but they had some shit on. They had some racks and stuff with ketchup and this stuff, and they had biscuits. And the old ladies would bring, I think, like biscuits to your table. It was before it was kind of like a fast food. It's not. It was kind of like a fast food restaurant then, but now, but back then it was kind of more like a sit down kind of IHOP, Denny's. It was like a sit down, like fine dining meal, right? Not luxury, but fine dining meal where you get to go out to church and sit down with your family and have a great meal. At Grandy's. Michael Rosser used to work there, but anyway, that's the character she kind of had a little bit, and I talked to her, and she had heard me speak, and she said, "Hector, you could really talk really well." And I remember, we gave a speech, and I had my little flashcards, and in this sort of speech, I was able to really be very elaborate, and I talked about drugs. I talked about the chemicals, THC, the seeds and whatnot, and weed and what it does. And even though I was showing up to class smoking, when I was in 8th grade, at least in for about 80-70% of that class, in the entire 8th grade, I was smoking weed nearly every single fucking day. Every other day. I hardly ever, it was like 75% at least. That entire year, I was smoking every fucking day. And I would take a couple drags just to get a quick buzz, and then I'd jump on a bus just to go to school. I wouldn't get sometimes blazed or anything like that. I'd just take a couple hits off a joint, all the time. I do this all the time. I'd get up, before just to catch a buzz, and then I'd go to school just to kind of chill. And anyway, but I remember Mrs. Hughes and this is what I wanted to talk about. Mrs. Hughes. Mrs. Hughes was talking, and she sort of she looked kind of sad, and she used to always pivot her head like this, like. And she could never stop pivoting her head. And she couldn't stop pivoting her head because she was on a vacation with her husband, and she went on a River Rapids ride, like in a Grand Canyon. I don't think it was a Grand Canyon, but it was somewhere. And she somehow fell off or flew off the raft, and she hit her head on a rock. And it didn't kill her, but it did some sort of damage to her brain that caused her head and her nervous system to do this. And she could think perfectly fine. She could, communicate. She just would always kind of move like this. And she says, I can't help it. It was from an accident that happened many years ago. And she was very nice, and I remember her speaking to her. And I know when I was in 7th grade, there's a lot of kids that didn't seem to like her, or some of them didn't seem, but except everybody's kids. But I remember her saying, we're talking about our future in life, and some teachers connect really good with students, when you talk the reality of life. And I always knew that when I was 15 years old and I came in contact with people that were like in their 60s, people were like 65. When I came in contact with people that were very old, I understood them greater always than any other student, because you got to keep in mind, my father was 72 years old when I was 12 years old. So I gathered a lot of this sort of 1940s and 1930s vibe that was just had a very old school sense of survival, I want to say, like the impressions of what that culture was carry through life. And I knew that since I understood so much of this, and so the depression and all this, so when you come in contact with people that are in their 60s, even though they weren't as old as my dad, maybe they were 15 years younger, there was an era of very similar references that I could understand how that person grew up at a more of a personal note, as opposed to people that just didn't have old parents, that you just went to go and see with your grandma or anything like that. The person I called dad was really old and from ancient times. So, but I remember her saying in the last few, months of me going to school, and and she used to be very nice, and she just kind of nod her head and just do that, and she seemed to favor me, and I could always see which teachers really liked me for very particular reasons. I wasn't sure exactly, but I do recall. I do recall her saying, which the entire time in this video I was trying to say is she had a bit of a depression, and we're talking about our futures, and she goes, well, he goes, by that time I'll be dead and long gone, he goes, I'm old now, I'm going to be retired probably the next few years, or this is going to be my last year. And, life moves on really fast, and we were talking about, like, oh, we won't forget you, Miss Hughes, and she was like, oh, I won't even be here anymore in this world, and she talked about it like, not necessarily it would the very depressive way, but it was a reality of like how life passes by. Like, to me, I got this impression that she was just to stay is safe and leisure from what little she had to just move forward and how life is, and not really seek of anything other than her being a teacher. And I thought she was a wonderful teacher. But I thought it was important because I do recall I knew which teachers communicated with other teachers and which ones wanted to engage with other students that were healthy or not healthy. And I don't know, but I felt that I knew that I was just more observant than the rest of the students. And I think it just had to do with just being at nursing homes and having an old father and the way that I was raised. So, anyway, I recall, I do recall that that those circumstances and I wanted to talk about that. Yeah, she was the teacher that gave the paper for it, so you had your parents sign it, and you could talk to the teacher. Talk to the guy that was from the Holocaust. And but anyway, I'm gonna go take a look at this probably sometime soon. Maybe this Friday, maybe next. I'm supposed to go there this past Friday. I passed by there, and I was like, I'm just gonna do this maybe next week or something. I just really wasn't in the mood right in the situation. I got too much shit that's going on. But I thought I'd make a video on that. Because I remember there was a lot of conflict at DeWitt Perry as well between the straights and the lesbians. Because the lesbians and the transgenders it was just so overwhelming of like how some of these people and how much durant bullshit they were having to deal with, and how the women survive because they know that so much of the gays that they get with a gay man, then they know they can just dominate everything because straight men have a very weak unity. It's just breeding purposes. The functioning in the world that we live in isn't the way that they think it is, but it's survival. It's just like if you have a gun, you put a relation to God and all this other shit, but a gun will kill you, and if you don't have a gun, you don't have nothing to protect yourself, but you're still alive and that person's dead. You can go on about whatever you're going to go after when you're dead, but the bottom line, that's a dead body and you're alive, period. There is no ifs, ands. You can make up your gods and make up your stories, whatever, but that one's dead, that one's alive, that one's dead, that one's alive, period. That's black or white, that's it. Just, Um, and, you know, I remember there was a lot of conflict, and that's why Miss Hughes never wanted to talk to these motherfuckers, because there was a lot of situations going on there. And I remember, and I was thinking of this, I was like, this shit's been going on for a fucking long time. And Miss Weiss, she really, because I remember just watch her, and because there was so much shit that was going on. I remember her doing this shit, like, because the transgenders there and the gays that were the teachers. I mean, it was really violent. It was just really fucking bad. And I remember one time, like, I could tell who wanted to give you free grades in school. I remember being in summer school, and I remember there were specific teachers, like this really super flamboyant teacher. And but he was dressed like just like a normal dude, but he was just like super flamboyant of a voice. I mean, he had no shame, and I wasn't judgmental of it. And I remember having for a math class, and I remember if you got on some of these guys' good sides, you were good to go. You got set up. If you didn't, you watch out for your fucking life, you know. And I didn't understand, because obviously he was. You could obviously say that this guy was probably not straight, you know. But I do recall getting some sort of free grades. That was one class I remember in summer school where we weren't really doing enough work in the class, and I remember there was an ally of, like, you're one of them. You get one of them, you get extra for them, and and I remember looking at the grades, and I remember I didn't do anything, but I remember getting like a 90 or getting like 100, and I knew that was why. And one of the things that I knew, this teacher in my math class, and this is the same class I had a math class teacher with the guy that brought a gun to Newman Smith and waved it around, and Casey and Brian Yaki's head and the entire classroom. The woman was pregnant. Anyway, so you know, I got out of the class, and I remember walking. It was somewhere in the last 2 weeks, and I remember getting out of class, and I was walking down the hall, and I saw Miss Weiss, and she was talking on the overhead in class and just teaching the class. And as I was walking by, I remember just kind of looking, and I just was giving a piercing look, and I had no idea who was in the class. But I remember I saw Miss Weiss, and she looks up like this immediately, like she had these piercing eyes, like she was looking to see who was spying on her, who was coming. Like, I could tell that whatever her life was and what was going on, she had a lot of predatorial behavior. Like, when you have a lot of predatorial behavior, the person will then start to become that the result of that. So you start to tend to look at your eyes and sort of act, maybe not necessarily act paranoid, but you're much more alert to see what threat is next, as opposed to being very leisure and very relaxed, where you don't have to worry about shit. And that's not how it works. And I could tell when I was walking by, and this is at Ted Polk middle school, and I was going from, what was it? I was going from was it from 7th? Yeah, I was going from 7th to then I think it was 8th grade, or was it 9th grade? No, because that year was the year that I went to. I think I was going from 7th to 8th grade, or I was going from 8th to the 9th. I'm going to say it could have been 8th to 9th grade, but I was thinking, I remember I went to summer school with Daniel Box. That's the only year I got to go to summer school with Daniel Box at R.L. Turner. And I remember that. So yeah, I think, I don't know what, I can't remember what year. It was either 7th or 8th grade. And I remember being in that class, and I remember that Miss I was walking in Miss Weiss's class, walking by, and she had this paranoia the same way that I remember, and I knew she was being traumatized. I knew like this when I saw her because it was in the middle of class and everyone was really calm, and she didn't make an alert. She would draw on like she was looking to see who was spying on her, who was coming after her, and I just was looking by, and she had these piercing eyes, but she was just looking to see who was coming or what was going on next. Who's the next one that's going to show up? And that's a behavior that happens when, like, as it happened to me, where you start to get so affected by the threats that were so aggressive. You're trying to survive, and they're just coming after you because they know they're going to steal the next thing, and they can just take control because there's no authority. They just take and steal whatever the fuck they want. Because there's such a unity in that. It's hard to describe what that brutality is. It's like a pack of hyenas. That's the best way that I can explain it. Because the problem is that you have the police officers like that, and then the jailhouse staff and all that shit that goes on. That is 100,000% why. Because even when you have someone that breaks out of that circle that makes things a little bit different, it isn't going to change that you still have about 1,500 police officers waiting for you, and the judges and the lawyers or the prosecutors that are going to fuck you over, that are all homosexuals and trans, and they'll run their own fucking game there. And you won't ever get a fair break of restraint. It just doesn't work that way. You're much better off to have it worse. You're much more off. You're worse if you're straight. But you can't do anything about it. That's just, that's how we function, and that's just the way it is. They have their gay bridges. But I thought it was important for me to talk about that because, I was thinking of that over the last few weeks, here and there, and I was just like, I remember that shit. I remember that this whole predatorial shit that was going on with them was real fucking bad. Like, they were living such a fantasy world and shit. They were living such a fantasy world and the world that they were living in that they were living in such a fantasy world that they just get anything they fucking want. I remember the teacher, like how they would interact and how they could take control, and how the females would just be warded off to a fucking corner because there wasn't enough females. It was all the trans and them getting together and doing this shit, and then they would, and it's really fucked up because I think about a lot of the details about what happened when I was with Miss Lowry, with Matt Lowry's mother, which I think she was a brilliant tutor and brilliant teacher who helped me tremendous in school. But there was also a lot of behavior there and in the contact mastery class that had to do with my dead sister. Had to do with the rape. And I didn't know anything about that. And it was being brought up. So it's really wild, because every once in a while I come across something that reminds you that that's why Miss Lowry was doing that, because of the dead little girl, because my sister lived right next door, or that's why, it's because that's why that teacher started to say something about that girl over there next door, and so they would do shit, because I remember them doing shit. I remember, like, Miss Lowry talking to one of Miss Berger, and then Miss Wahlberger, both of them, and they would be talking like women would do, thinking that kids really don't attentively understand what they're talking about because they're talking adult talk, because they skip all these things, but I understood what they were talking about, and I remember her just doing this. And doing that shit, and, so anyway, it doesn't really fucking matter. I understand it doesn't really fucking matter, but I remember that shit. I remember Miss Hughes and Miss Weiss, and there was just a handful of teachers that they get their ass cornered. And women are much more better at defending the situation, understanding the herd of packs of how they run. But it's brutal. It was fucking brutal. Like Miss Weiss, I remember her husband was like a police officer, and he was like I don't know if he was like a detective. He could have been, and she had to bring him in, like not, and he was in a regular class to put some sort of because these motherfuckers were just like, take anything you want. This is our show. They're having a shit show. Nobody's gonna stop us, and we'll go the higher above whatever we want because they're all gay and transgender over there as well. So you had to get one of these guys that was going to break out of that circle at some point because you're not going to be able to do it straight. It's not going to happen. You're much more powerful with a pack of herds. So anyway, more likely to anyway. Not saying that it can't, but anyway, I thought I'd make a video on that. I talked for about 36 minutes now. I gotta make a